Ever feel like you've waded through just a mountain of information,
Yeah.
hacking away at it, and then you get to the end and think, okay, so what was the actual point?
Mm.
What am I supposed to take away?
Yeah, that feeling of trying to pull out the real gold nuggets.
Exactly. That's what we're tackling today on the deep dive. We're zeroing in on how researchers take all their findings and distill them down into those crucial bits, the conclusions and recommendations.
Mm.
And our guide for this is a really useful document, Designing Conclusions and Recommendations.
Right. And our mission, really, for you today is to make that whole process super clear. We want you to get how solid research takes findings and turns them into, well, meaningful conclusions and recommendations that actually point somewhere.
And hopefully spot some common pitfalls too.
Definitely. We'll flag those so you can recognize them, whether you're looking at like a formal study or even just a report you get at work. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding those final, really important steps in research.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The source starts by making this really strong point about a direct link. It says conclusions and recommendations have to come straight from the research findings.
That's the bedrock, isn't it? It's not about, suddenly pulling rabbits out of hats at the end.
Right, or rehashing things already discussed.
Exactly. These last sections should just flow naturally from what the research actually found. The source is pretty clear. If the research is done well, the original goals you set out with, they basically provide the outline for your conclusions and recommendations.
Okay. So you look back at what you wanted to find out.
Precisely. And see what the evidence you gathered actually says. It's like a judge summing up the decision has to be based only on the evidence presented in court, nothing else.
And this isn't just a suggestion, it's like a hard rule. The findings are the only source.
The only legitimate source, yeah. You can't bring in surprise information or, theories you didn't test at the very end. What your investigation turned up, that's what drives the conclusions, period.
Okay. Got it. Now, to help the reader actually follow that logic, the source talks about the importance of having a summary right before you get to the conclusions and recommendations.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just like being nice to the reader, it's actually essential for setting the stage properly.
Like a quick recap.
Sort of. The source suggests a concise overview. What was the main issue? What questions were asked? How was the data gathered? And what were the main things found? Just enough to remind the reader and give context.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then this is important. There should be a separate summary just of the findings. And here's the key thing the source really hammers home. That summary should only contain information that you've already talked about in the findings section of the report. No new twists.
Okay. So, no, by the way, we also found this.
Yeah, exactly. It has to be transparent, build the case piece by piece. And the source specifically warns against pulling stuff from the literature review, the review of precedent research, into this finding summary.
Why is that so important, that distinction?
Well, because that summary needs to be purely about this specific study, the original work done, the literature review. That's crucial, but its job is different. It gives you the theories, the background, the lens to interpret your findings,
Right, to see where they fit in the bigger picture.
Exactly. But it isn't your findings. And same goes for any totally new piece of information. If you suddenly drop it in right before the conclusions, it kind of damages the credibility of the whole process.
Okay, so we have this clear path. Findings lead to conclusions and recommendations, but the source also talks about constraints, like boundaries on what you can actually conclude. The first big one is external validity, generalizability.
Yeah, basically, how widely can you apply these results? It's a huge deal.
So like your example, if a study only looked at teens in cities, you can't just assume the findings apply to, say, older folks in the countryside.
Precisely. The source makes it really clear that the design of your study dictates its reach. If you did, say, a few detailed case studies, your conclusions really only apply strongly to situations very similar to those cases.
You can't just stretch it too far.
Nope. You can't suddenly generalize to a totally different group or context without evidence.
And the example of the U.S. population sample is good here.
Yeah.
If you do a proper random sample of the U.S., you can probably generalize back to the U.S. population, broadly speaking.
Right. With appropriate caveats, usually. But, and the source is explicit here, you absolutely cannot then take those findings and say, oh, this must be true for people in South Africa or Korea or France, not unless you actually studied people in those places.
It really comes down to who is actually in your study.
It really does. And the second big constraint is about the limitations encountered during the research. real-world stuff
Oh,
happens.
yeah, even the best plans can hit snags. What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, the source lists things like maybe a lot of people you asked didn't respond to your survey. That's non-response bias.
Right.
Or maybe people skipped lots of questions, giving incomplete answers. Or perhaps certain documents you really needed just weren't available. These practical problems, they can definitely weaken your conclusions or limit how broadly they apply.
That makes sense. They affect the data you actually have.
And another one they mention is the researcher's own potential influence. Did the way you asked questions maybe nudge people towards certain answers? That's also a limitation you need to acknowledge.
Because it affects the findings themselves.
Exactly, and therefore the conclusions you can draw from them.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about common mistakes. The source points out that sometimes researchers, maybe especially newer ones, kind of jump the gun. They start drawing conclusions too early in the report.
Oh, this is a big one. The source actually mentions a real example, a doctoral student who started putting conclusions way back in chapter 1, in the introduction.
Wow.
Yeah. And apparently it continued through the literature review and even mixed into the findings section itself.
So why is scattering them around like that such a problem for the person reading it?
Well, think about how people often read these things. They might read the intro, the purpose, the research questions, maybe glance at the methods.
And then often skip right to the end,
Okay.
to the summary and conclusions.
Exactly. Or sometimes just the recommendations. So if your key takeaways, your conclusions, are sprinkled all over the place.
People are likely going to miss them, or at least miss the connection to the evidence.
Precisely. They won't get the full picture or understand why you concluded what you did. It breaks the logical flow.
And the source gives a handy tip for spotting this, doesn't it? Look for certain words.
Yeah, it suggests keeping an eye out for words like should, ought to, or must appearing in earlier chapters, like the findings or literature review.
Because those words usually signal a conclusion or a recommendation.
Right. If you see those cropping up before the dedicated conclusion section, it's a red flag. It probably means something's been put in the wrong place. The advice is simple. Move those statements to the conclusions chapter where they belong and where the supporting findings are summarized.
Okay, good practical advice.
Yeah.
Now, the source also brings up something I think is often overlooked but really useful. Recommendations for further study.
Yes. This is interesting because it acknowledges that pretty much any research project, no matter how focused, tends to spark new questions or uncover related areas that weren't the main point.
So this section isn't an apology like, oops, we didn't figure everything out.
Not at all. It's more about recognizing that research often opens more doors than it closes. It highlights the richness of the process and points the way for others.
And the idea is to give some direction for that future work.
Yeah, the source suggests outlining the what, who, why, where, and how for potential follow-up studies. It's about capturing those valuable side discoveries or unanswered questions in a way that someone else could potentially pick them up.
That's a great way to contribute beyond just the immediate findings.
Definitely.
And finally, there's that helpful table in this source table 9, I think. It visually connects the conclusions and recommendations back to the whole research design.
It's a neat summary. It really reinforces the idea we've been discussing that conclusions and recommendations are the end point of the study. They flow from the earlier stages. They don't feed back into them.
And looking at that table, the main message that jumps out again is
that the findings are the sole basis, the absolute foundation for conclusions and recommendations. Nothing else from the study directly feeds into them in the same way.
right. And the table also clarifies the role of the lit review again, doesn't it?
Yes, it explicitly shows the review of precedent research provides the theoretical perspectives, the context for interpreting your findings, but it does not provide data or information for drawing the actual conclusions about your own research questions.
It helps explain the why, but not the what of your specific results.
You got it. That's a
Right.
good way to put it.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for you, our listener. The main takeaway seems really clear. Conclusions and recommendations in research aren't just tacked on. They have to be built methodically, directly from the study's findings.
And they're always shaped, always constrained by the study's design, who was studied, how, and also by any limitations, any problems that came up during the research.
And getting them clearly laid out in their own section at the end is crucial for the reader.
Absolutely. Which leads to maybe a provocative thought for you to consider.
Uh-huh.
How can understanding this process, how conclusions should be built on evidence, help you look more critically at information you see every day? Not just research papers, but like news reports, work analyses, marketing claims.
Yeah, asking yourself, are the conclusions they're drawing really supported by the evidence they actually presented? Or are there gaps? Are they maybe pulling in outside ideas without justification?
Exactly. It's about becoming a sharper, more critical consumer of information generally.
Definitely something to think about. So, what other parts of research methods have you curious? We'd love to tackle more in future deep dives.